When most folks think about witch trials, the mind goes straight to Salem, Massachusetts, and the tragic events between 1692 and 93. That event that claimed 20 innocent lives. Salem was indeed a horrific chapter in history, and those victims are well remembered. And here's a little bit more of the story that often gets overlooked. These are the European witch hunts that raged across the continent for centuries. While Salem's tragedy unfolded over a few months, Europe experienced systematic persecution spanning generations and ultimately claiming tens of thousands of lives in what became one of history's most widespread campaigns of terror. The European witch hunts represent one of the most organized and brutal campaigns of persecution in human history. These weren't random outbursts of fear and superstition. This was a calculated, sustained assault on anyone deemed an enemy of religious and social order. These persecutions crossed national boundaries without hesitation, targeted people regardless of social standing, and employed methods of torture and execution that reveal the darkest capabilities of human cruelty. Now, in my mind, I think we can go back as far as the Inquisition, that whole Pope Gregory thing around 1233, possibly even longer. But the reason I say it goes back that far is that the definition of witch and heretic have quite a bit of overlap. When you examine the numbers from these European witch hunts, the scope of human suffering becomes mind-blowing. In the Valais region, nestled between what is now France and Switzerland, they experienced what historians consider Europe's first major witch trial campaign from 1428 to 1447. This persecution claimed 367 lives, though the actual number was probably a good bit higher. What's particularly striking is that men and women were killed in equal numbers, which challenges many people's assumptions about these trials. This campaign established the terrible precedents that would follow and what they brought here with them. Systemic torture and the virtual impossibility of surviving an accusation. The German territories witnessed some of the most extensive methodical persecution campaigns in European history. Trier endured a devastating period between 1581 and 93, during which 368 people from 22 villages were burned alive, with nearly all confessing. Yeah, that word confessing. I know you heard me roll my eyes. Yeah, but they confessed under torture. The authorities approached these mass killings with bureaucracy and efficiency, treating systematic murder as an administrative procedure. The torture methods employed in Trier were brutal. Victims were subjected to the strappado, when their arms were bound behind their backs and they were hoisted by their wrists with a rope until their shoulders dislocated. Weights were often added to their feet to intensify the agony. The thumb screws crushed fingers slowly while victims screamed for mercy that never came. Sleep deprivation was used to break down the psychological resistance. Prisoners were kept awake for days until their minds just began to fracture. But perhaps most horrifically, the Trier authorities perfected the use of graduated torture. They would begin with lighter methods like binding and stretching, and then escalate systematically through increasingly severe techniques. Hot irons were applied to sensitive areas of the body. The rack stretched limbs until joints separated. Some victims had their fingernails torn out or were subjected to what was euphemistically called water torture. Yeah, and that's exactly what you're thinking. It's the same thing as waterboarding, where you're strapped to a board and they put a cloth over your face. Water is dumped on your face and onto that cloth until you start to gag and can't catch your breath, and then the water is stopped, but with the wet rag over your face, you still can't breathe. The torturers kept detailed records of each session, Noting which methods produced confessions most quickly, they documented how long each victim lasted under specific tortures, creating, I guess, what we could compare to a database of suffering. What made this even more sinister was that the confession was extracted through these torments and were used to justify the torture of the next victims in an endless cycle manufactured by evidence and forced admissions. But Trier was only the beginning. The German states developed witch hunting into a terrifyingly organized system. In Würzburg, Prince Bishop Julius Ector's campaign between 1626 and 31 claimed approximately 900 lives, including his own nephew, several canons, and numerous children. When religious authorities were willing to execute their own family members, it shows how completely moral constraints had collapsed. Bamberg saw Prince Bishop Gottfried Johann George Fuchs Torheimer, oh, what a name, kill over 1,000 people during that same period. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of violence. They were systematic, state-sponsored murder campaigns directed by the highest religious authorities. The princes created an infrastructure of persecution, building special witch houses dedicated to interrogation and torture, maintaining meticulous records as if they were managing any other bureaucratic function. They even employed traveling witch commissioners who moved from town to town, creating a circuit of terror that left nothing but devastation in its wake. Scotland's persecution began with the North Berwick trials of 1590, marking the start of a campaign that would span nearly 150 years and claim between 3,000 and 4,000 lives by 1707. The Scottish authorities institutionalized the entire process, establishing witch hunting commissions that could be activated at any time. Local magistrates could request torture warrants through official channels, transforming paranoia into legitimate government procedure. Oh, goodness. Scotland experienced waves of persecution: 1590, 97, 1628, 31, 1649 through 50, and a massive panic between 1661 and 62. Oh my gosh, it claimed over 660 lives. Perhaps the most horrific single event occurred at Torsacker, Sweden between 1674 and 75 in what may be the largest witch trial massacre in recorded history. 71 accused witches, including 65 women, were beheaded and burned in a single day. This represented approximately 1/5 of all the women in the region, essentially destroying the female population of entire communities. The Torsacker massacre climaxed Sweden's Great Noise, a witch panic that swept through the country in the 1670s. It began when children claimed they had been taken to witches' sabbats at a place called Baluka. Authorities accepted these testimonies without question, and the children became witch detectors, identifying supposed witches in church congregations. The entire campaign was built on children's testimony, children who were coached, threatened, and sometimes provided the correct answers. What made Torsacker particularly horrific was its speed and efficiency. There were no lengthy trials or elaborate procedures. People were simply executed assembly line style, their bodies burned in a massive bonfire. A local minister, so traumatized by witnessing these events that his family spoke of it for decades afterward. When a religious leader whose profession required him to contemplate damnation was horrified by what he witnessed, it reveals a true depth of evil he never hoped to encounter. The European witch trials were characterized by systematic and widespread use of brutal torture methods to extract confessions from the accused. These trials used torture to obtain the confessions. And I don't know. I think sometimes maybe people just confess to stop the pain. It created a cycle of accusations and executions. So if I extract a confession out of you, well, who were you in cahoots with? Who am I going after next? It spread through communities like the plague. We've talked a little bit about some of the torture methods that were used, and I think the strappado was their most common form. We did say a little bit about that, and there were the basic forms of that, where victims were suspended with their arms behind their back. Well, it's okay to hurt them just a little bit. I think that's in the book. But if they refused to confess and continued telling you the truth and you wouldn't believe it, they added short, sudden drops. Hoist them up a little bit, drop them right quick. That was excruciating. And even if you survive this, you're going to feel this. If it doesn't cause permanent damage, well, I'm not even going to say because I bet it did. And then sometimes they would add weights to the victim's ankles. The shoulders and arms were completely dislocated. Adding weights to the legs could also cause permanent damage to your legs and ankles while you were dropped. And while this method didn't cause horrible internal core injuries, it permanently damaged nerves and ligaments, and often survivors were left with lifelong disabilities. And we had the thumb screws. It was deceptively simple, but very effective. Essentially a vise with protruding studs on the interior surfaces. Victims would be forced to place their thumbs between two metal plates connected by screws that were slowly tightened while you were questioned. The crushing bars were sometimes lined with these sharp points, meant to puncture your skin and nails. I know how bad it hurts to smack my thumb with the hammer. I can't. Oh, no, don't imagine that. That's bad. A particularly heartbreaking example occurred in 1596 when the son and daughter of Alison Balfour, accused of witchcraft, were tortured in front of her to force her confession. Her son endured 57 strokes, while her 7-year-old daughter endured the thumb screws. They also used sleep deprivation. That was extensively used. Victims were kept awake for days, and then suddenly awakened and questioned, and then finally allowed a brief rest. They also did waterboarding, used the rack, burning, flogging, binding, stretching. It was all standard tools in the arsenal of the suffering they inflicted. The Holy Roman Empire's adoption of the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina in 1530 institutionalized this brutality within the legal system. It placed accused witches at the mercy of magistrates who served simultaneously as judge, investigator, prosecutor, and defense counsel. The law provided for secret interrogation, denied legal counsel to the accused, required torture to extract confessions when they weren't freely given, and mandated execution by burning. In 1486, German churchman and inquisitor Heinrich Kramer published what became the handbook for this type of persecution, the Malleus Maleficarum. Be careful how you pronounce that. I'm finna tell you why. Commonly translated as the Hammer of Witches, was written by Kramer under his Latinized name, Henricus Institor. It was first published in Speyer, Germany. Scholars note that the Latin grammar reveals something sinister. The feminine form, Maleficarum, would only be used for women, while the masculine, Maleficorum, would refer to men alone or both genders together. This suggests the manual was suspiciously and specifically designed to target women. The Malleus served as a judicial handbook for detecting witches, establishing rules of evidence and procedures by which suspected witches were tortured and executed. Thousands of people, primarily women, were judicially murdered following the procedures described in the book, often for nothing more than having a birthmark, living alone, or suffering a mental illness, cultivating medicinal herbs, or simply being falsely accused for someone else's financial gain. You see, it was a land grab. If a woman was left a widow and inherited something from her husband, Well, women can't own stuff because she can't manage it properly, and that's too big of a property to let it sit in the hands of a woman, so a man could come along and take it from her. The book's popularity was enormous, going through 28 editions between 1486 and 1600. It was accepted by both Roman Catholics and Protestants as authoritative. This manual was divided into 3 sections. Part 1 established the reality of evil and nature of witches, condemning disbelief in demonology as heresy. Yeah, there we go. There's the Inquisition word, heresy. And stating that any witness could testify against an accused person. Part 2 compiled stories about witches and their supposed activities, pacts with the devil, supernatural flight, and shape-shifting. Part 3 outlined legal procedures for witch trials, explicitly sanctioning torture as a means of securing a confession. It provided step-by-step instructions from initiating accusations to formal charging and execution. This was essentially an instruction manual for legalized murder. It was devastating and unfortunately effective. The systemic nature of these torture methods, combined with legal endorsement and presumption of guilt, created what amounted to a confession factory designed to validate predetermined conclusions rather than determine actual guilt or innocence. And I don't think a witch, if she was a witch in a real sense of the term, that's not guilt. That's a profession. That's a religion. Anyway, I may do another episode about that. While fear of witchcraft spread throughout Europe, the specific reasons behind each witch hunt varied significantly. Understanding what drove entire communities to abandon basic human decency is essential to comprehending how this systematic persecution persisted across different countries and cultures. The Valais trials began with what appeared to be a demonic process. Delegates from 7 districts requested investigations and accused witches or sorcerers. This grassroots origin reveals that ordinary people themselves initiated these persecutions, reflecting deep-seated fears that had been building within the communities. However, once the machinery of persecution began operating, it developed an unstoppable momentum. Political calculation played a crucial role in many of these campaigns. In Trier, newly appointed Archbishop Johann von Schoenberg sought to prove his loyalty to the Jesuits through brutal persecution. He systematically targeted 3 groups: Protestants, Jewish people, and accused witches, allowing him to eliminate political enemies while demonstrating his Catholic orthodoxy. Schoenberg's campaign wasn't driven by religious fanaticism alone. It was calculated political strategy disguised by holy righteousness. Having assumed the position of archbishop in 1581, he needed to prove himself a powerful Jesuit leader. This approach allowed him to eliminate anyone who posed a political threat under the guise of defending the faith. Protestant nobles with desirable lands, successful Jewish merchants, political rivals questioning his authority, all could be conveniently accused of witchcraft. The accusations became a comprehensive tool for removing inconvenient people while making it appear to serve the Lord. Royal obsession provided another driving force. King James of Scotland became personally fixated on eliminating witchcraft, even authoring a book called Demonology that gave royal endorsement to the witch hunting. His obsession began when storms were blamed on supernatural intervention during his voyage to marry Princess Anne. James became convinced that witches were personally targeting him. James didn't remain a distant observer. He personally attended interrogation sessions, taking notes during the torture. I'm giving him a little extra time, wasn't I? His 1597 book on demonology served as a how-to manual, stating that experience daily proves how loath they are to confess without torture. Yeah, what he said. When the most powerful person in the kingdom publishes instructions for torturing confessions out of people, every ambitious official begins seeing that witches are everywhere. In Fulda, Prince Abbot Bashir von Dernbach, what a name, right? Launched his own campaign between 1603 and 1606, seeking to purge anything he deemed improper. Having been previously removed from power for excessive zealotry, he returned with determined vengeance. Well, yeah, some things don't change. He weaseled his way back in. His campaign targeted just not accused witches, but anyone whose behavior didn't conform to his vision of proper Catholic conduct. Protestant Jews, folk healers, midwives, traditional medicine practitioners, over 250 people were executed, including children as young as 7. England's Pendle witch trials occurred in an impoverished, lawless area of Lancashire, where folk healing and fortune-telling provided essential community services. The persecution began with a feud between the Device and Whittle families, longtime adversaries, when young Alison Device encountered a peddler who collapsed after she asked him for pins. Accusations began spreading like wildfire. Families turned against each other, with Alison Device confessing and immediately implicating her own grandmother. Other family members followed suit, creating a cascade of accusations that draw in neighbors and strangers alike. The trials became a mechanism for settling old grudges and redistributing the community's limited wealth. The European witch trials provided virtually no legal protection for the accused. Once someone was accused, survival became nearly impossible, regardless of the outcome. Valais established a rule that accused of witchcraft 3 times, you would be automatically arrested. This created a system where anyone with a personal grudge could effectively sentence someone to death by convincing 2 other people to make the accusation with them. In Trier, almost no one charged with witchcraft was ever released. When conviction rates were approximately 100%, the system has abandoned any pretense of seeking out any sort of truth in favor of predetermined outcomes serving political purposes. The Pendle trials demonstrated how accusations could multiply exponentially, with initial charges leading to self-incrimination and family betrayal. Alison Device's confession and accusation of her grandmother started a chain reaction where people implicated their own relatives to avoid the torture themselves, who would find themselves accused in turn. The Tosacker trials relied on testimony from 2 young boys who claimed they could see invisible devil's marks upon people's foreheads. Basing death sentences on children's claims about invisible evidence shows the complete abandonment of anything rational or legal. The proceedings were so irregular that courts executed people without reporting the death sentences to any higher authority. The European witch hunts represent one of history's darkest chapters, demonstrating how fear, superstition, political opportunism, and religious extremism can combine to create systematic campaigns of persecution, claiming tens of thousands of innocent lives. These events show how entire societies can abandon fundamental principles of justice and human decency when pursuing ideological purity and social control. Understanding these witch hunts is crucial, not only for comprehending this historical tragedy, but recognizing patterns of persecution and scapegoating that continue threatening today. The mechanisms driving these campaigns are the same: fear of outsiders, abandonment, legal protections, use of torture, exploitation of social tensions for all to meet your own ends. These remain relevant and serve as warnings about the frailty of justice and human rights when mass hysteria and authoritarian manipulation take hold. The past isn't dead. It continues to shape our present. That's exactly why we must remember these dark chapters, ensure we never repeat. The tens of thousands who died in these persecutions deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individual human beings whose lives were cut short by a system that valued conformity over justice, fear over reason, and power over dignity. Oh, I guess that's a good place to get off my soapbox now. Thank y'all for hanging with me. Sweet dreams. I'll see you next time.